Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was told I should speak from my seat here. Maybe you can put my PowerPoint slides up. So it is very appropriate that we start this very interesting conference with an explicit view, thank you, on us, on the human species. So the focus of my talk will be world population trends, and I've added a subtitle here, the rise of Homo sapiens literata, which I will explain later. You may have some questions about this. The main message there is, just to say it now at this point, that it's not only the head count, the number of people that matters, but what also greatly matters for human population trends is what is inside our heads. So here you see an estimate of the world population over the Christian era, and you see that up until around 1800 it was clearly below 1 billion for most of human history, well below 500 million people. There are some estimation points, and you see a little up and down. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, world population probably declined a little, and then you see the Black Death, and then the conquering of the Americas resulted in some population decline. But then something remarkable started during the 19th century, namely that the death rates started to decline, first in Northern Europe and then in the rest of Europe. And then after World War II, the death rates precipitously declined in all over the world, with the birth rates still being fairly high. And that resulted in significant population growth, and you see this spike of world population where we presently stand about 7.6 billion people, and you see these three colored lines. These are three scenarios for the future, but we'll talk about them later. So why do we think that world population will likely level off? Well, this is this theory of demographic transition. Here you see the world's longest continuous annual time series, which happens to be for Finland from 1722. Finland, of course, at that time was part of the Swedish kingdom. So in Sweden, for the whole kingdom, it was in 1749 that the Tabellverket collected information for the whole country. But for Finland, we have this reconstruction. And you see the black line is the deaths. You see 5-year averages because there were very strong annual fluctuations. And the blue line is the average birth. And you see there has been, whenever the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the population grows. You see that traditional societies in all European countries, as well as in most of the world before the modern demographic transition, was characterized by high fluctuations. And then after a big famine in Finland in the 1860s and around 1870, the death rates fell and never rose back up to that level. So this was the modern transition of mortality, and you see the birth rates stay high for some time because fertility norms are more embedded in cultural norms, and this just takes a longer time to adjust to the new conditions. And then you see with some time lag, the birth rates also fall. Here you see in Finland, like in many other Western countries, after World War II you have the baby boom, yet another increase followed by a decline. And just recently in the last period, the birth rates in Finland were about the same level as the death rates. Now let's move to a country that is part of the Africa region, the island of Mauritius, where we also have very good historical time series. And here you see even clearly that up until about 45, the death rates and birth rates both fluctuated strongly. They were about at the same level. By the way, you see this very high peak in death rates in 1918, which is the Spanish flu, which happened exactly 100 years ago, and which was probably the biggest mortality disaster in human history. It killed more people than the world wars all around the world. And then what you see that after World War II, in like in many other developing countries, in Mauritius, the death rate precipitously fall. You see, it really very steeply went down, while at the same time the birth rate even increased a little because women were in better health status and still wanted many children. And at that point, the growth rate of the population was between 3 and 4% per year. Massive population growth. In historical Europe, as you've seen, it's never been at that scale. And then the question is, what brought fertility down in Mauritius? Mauritius experienced the world's second most rapid fertility decline. And it's interesting, it was some scientific studies. At that time, a group of British researchers head by James Mead, who later got the Nobel Prize in economics, was sent there, and some of the members of his team said Mauritius is hell on earth. It really was trapped in the vicious cycle of very rapid population growth, extreme poverty, environmental degradation. It couldn't be a worse place. Well, they discussed these reports in Parliament, and went on with two key policies. The first is universal education of women, bring all girls to primary school. And then there was a mild government-supported family planning program. And interestingly, the Catholic Church, which is very influential in Mauritius, also joined forces. Of course, the Catholic organizations only offered natural family planning methods, but together they managed to particularly enhance the education of girls and bring down the fertility rate from more than 6 to less than 3 children per woman. And then the economic development followed thereafter, first in the textile industry, then tourism, and then finally electronics. And today, Mauritius is the most developed country in the Africa region, from one of the most miserable states. Okay, what brings down the death rate? There's a huge body of literature on this, of course, from historical mortality decline to modern. The conventional wisdom is it's the increasing living standards, it's increasing income. Well, you see on the left-hand side the famous Preston curve that shows that it has GDP per capita on the horizontal axis, and then the life expectancy at birth on the vertical. And you see at the beginning, yes, there's a steep increase, and then it flattens, so there are diminishing returns. And the other interesting thing you see that you see the curves moving upwards over time. And this has been interpreted as medical progress. So the same amount of income buys you more life expectancy with modern medical technology. Well, if you look at the other side, what we did here is we plot the mean years of schooling of the population instead of income. And here you see an interesting thing. First, it's much more linear. It's not perfectly linear, but it's much more linear. And this magic shift upward disappears. We, of course, did much more statistical analysis, but this picture already shows you that indeed education seems to be the better explanation of increasing life expectancy than income. And this is indeed what our studies tend to show us. You may see at the blue line for the very poor countries an interesting upward bend in just for 2010, the most recent year. And this is the stunning success of interventions by international donors on child mortality, particularly in Africa. Fertility, the pattern, this is a massive data set of developing countries, mostly of birth rates by level of female education. And what you see here, of course, there is some dispersion, but when you draw sort of the average lines through it, these 6 educational categories have a perfect ordering that the more educated the women are, the lower the level of fertility is. And the reason is that more educated women want fewer children, and they also find better ways to actually convince their partners and peers to have fewer children and find ways to actually avoid unplanned birth. Now, we've been putting this all together into a multidimensional demographic framework that really shows that education is not only an important variable in itself, but particularly for the demographic trends. We show here 2 scenarios. The one is that assuming the same education-specific fertility trends, we once have a very pessimistic education scenario, that is the constant enrollment numbers. There's essentially no new schools being built. And then we have the fast track development of education, which means that we follow, let's say, the South Korean or the Singaporean example of massive education expansion. That's, you see, the red is those without any education, and the dark blue are those with post-secondary tertiary education. And you see, of course, in the fast track, you have many more educated people, but the interesting thing is that with the identical fertility patterns, already by mid-century, this gives you 1 billion less in terms of world population, because more educated women have fewer children. Okay, this is our medium scenario for the world as a whole. You see from 1970 there you had in red still about 1/3 of the population without any formal education, never been to school. And much of the increase in the population since then has been adding more educated people. And this is also why we are more optimistic than the UN, who does not explicitly factor in the education in their projections, that indeed world population growth will stabilize at somewhere below 10 billion and then possibly even start a decline by the end of the century. But as you see, there are different scenarios based on stalled development or even accelerated social development that give you other outcomes. Now, there is a big literature now also how education and human capital is a key driver of economic growth, and we had a synthesis of many of these studies showing it's not just the primary education that matters, but also junior secondary education. And fortunately now the new Sustainable Development Goals, unlike the Millennium Development Goals that only focused on primary education, also have high quality primary and secondary education, and importantly for all girls and boys. Now we go back to this growth, and we added a second line here in orange, which is the total literate population. By now you may have heard why I think that education, and particularly the cognitive changes and enhancement that goes along with literacy, is so important. And literacy existed up until 300 years ago, so really for very tiny elites only. And you see then it became a mass phenomenon only over the 20th century, essentially. And now I'll introduce this term that I quite courageously present here for the first time, that the Homo sapiens literata as a subspecies of Homo sapiens, which is characterized by high abstraction capabilities associated with literacy, also codified knowledge that is in our cultures and legal system and institutions, complex socioeconomic institutions, and in consequence also modern science. That couldn't be thinkable without literacy. Of course, you don't easily propose a new subspecies, so I went to probably the world's leading institution, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and discussed the concept with the directors there, and got, in a way, their approval for introducing this term as just to signify the importance that educated people really are different in many key respects. So, of course, literacy is an acquired capability that is culturally transmitted and thus primarily part of also irreversible cultural evolution. But it also causes lasting changes in the synaptic structure of our brains. So Eric Kandel, who got the Nobel Prize in medicine in 2000 for his brain research, he often says, like, let's repeat this issue now for the second and the third time, and now your brain structures are fundamentally changed for the rest of your life. So when you go out this door, you are physiologically a different person than when entering. So could you please go back to my slides? Okay. Empirical studies show that most transformative social changes are associated with the spread of universal female literacy. It's not only with the fertility, evidently, but we also showed that many other fundamental social things like the move to democracy, it's really happened when women were more educated and not just men. And this really started with the Reformation. You may remember that Luther said that auch das geringste Mägdlein, even the lowest maid, should learn how to read the Bible. And this is an innovation in human history, because even in ancient Athens or in the Tuscan towns in the Renaissance time that were fairly literate, women were not part of this. So now then the Protestant countries of Northern Europe were the first ones to have universal, also female education, which also helped to trigger the Industrial Revolution and many of these other things. So if I also talked to a leading Latin scholar and asked him, well, Homo typically, of course, is masculine, but he said, no, it can have both gender, and if you want to emphasize the female right, it's okay to say Homo sapiens literata. Okay, let's go back to 1900. This was the world, how it looked like. You see, as I said, in green, the highly educated former Protestant parts, and then the rest of Europe moderately, and most of the developing countries today, of course, they have almost no literacy. Now I was looking, we have for many countries reconstructed time series, and of course for the Vatican you cannot meaningfully have a population pyramid, but at least I took Italy. Italy had a census early in 1901, and here you see the Italian population at that time. You see a very young population, lots of children, very few elderly, and you see that still at that time half of the Italian population had never been to school, and the vast other majority of the other half had only some primary education, almost no secondary. Well, in 1930, the situation had improved a little. You have less people who've never seen a school, the majority just having a little schooling, but no secondary as well. So it was only after World War II, then you see that the mass education took hold in Italy, as in many other European countries. And you also see nice this mechanism that the young ones get better educated than the older ones. And of course, as they move up the age pyramid, because education is something you maintain for the rest of your life, you see that gradually the population gets more educated. 1990, also the upper secondary and tertiary kicks in, but you still have this very low educated men and particularly women in Italy. And then 2010, this is the most recent. Then you also see the effect of very low fertility, partly because the more educated women tend to have fewer children. So this is an aging population, which poses its own challenges that we can later discuss. Now for the world, this is the world population pyramid by education in 1970. You see there it was, again, a very young population. This is, of course, dominated by the developing countries. And there you see about a third of the world population had never seen a school from inside in 1970. And the population has grown now by 2010. Now we have 7 billion, before we had about 3.5. And you still have this 1 billion uneducated people, sometimes called the bottom billion. But many of the people added to the world population had indeed sort of intermediate education. So humanity has really made progress in its human capital. Now, already sort of putting this into a broader context, we will hopefully discuss quite a bit the Sustainable Development Goals that in 2015 were decided for the world. And there is some criticism that the demography and population is not at all mentioned. Actually, I happen to be one of the 15 scientists charged by the UN Secretary General to produce the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019, and will plan to highlight this fact that indeed population is absent. The good news is that particularly in the DG 3 on health and 4 on education, there are many goals and many sub-goals and targets that impact on population trends. So we've recently calculated new world population scenarios asking what will be the population trend if the SDGs are successfully implemented. You see these 3 solid lines are again 3 scenarios. Stalled development is the top line where we'll end up by 12 or 13 billion people. The green line looks the most likely from our perspective, and the red one is really a rapid enhancement throughout the century. Now the SDGs focus only on 2015 to 30, and we assume what happens if there is a boost. Yes, I know the time. Can you go, please? Okay, so you see that this blue shaded area would be the population trend that is lower than the most likely medium scenario, if indeed for the coming years there is this boost in education and health. And of course, if the boost continues to the end of the century, then you would be more like on the red line. The green area above is the UN range, which, as I said, is higher, partly because they do not explicitly address the issue of education improvement and have a more extrapolative model. Now, the bad news is that with all this importance of education, spending for education as part of total spending in development assistance is really declining. It declined from 13 to 10% of the total, and you see the real boost is in infrastructure and health. Health spending is about twice as much as education spending. Well, we've also summarized evidence and wrote about the fact that education can also be a very important enhancement of the adaptive capacity towards already unavoidable climate change, for climate change adaptation. And there is this Green Climate Fund with pledged of more than $100 billion per year. And as it looks now, most of this money is dedicated to infrastructure building and really big dams or seawalls or whatsoever. Even so, we don't exactly know what will be the specific climate conditions and the specific challenges. So our point is that empowering people through universal education actually enhances them to react flexibly. And this subtitle that Science Magazine put there actually got me quite some angry calls from engineers: fund more educators rather than just engineers. But the only thing we are saying is that not all the money should go to engineers. Okay, it's time to wrap up. This notion of the Homo sapiens literata that I try to introduce here is somehow isomorphic to the notion of the Anthropozene, which is not a real conventional geological era. So we want to signal something with this, we want to say something. And I guess we can say that Homo sapiens literata managed to improve our living conditions and also in consequence grow in numbers. But this also contributes to threatening our own life support systems. To achieve the global sustainability transformation, humanity needs brain-based insight and foresight. We need to act in anticipation of the problems and not just react to things that we experience. And here we need the very best science, but we also need all members of population to be able to effectively use their brains. And this has been the topic of a recent symposium I organized with the Leopoldina on brain power for sustainable development, the cognitive preconditions for a successful sustainability transition. Okay, my time is over, and the key message again is that we should not only look at the head count, but also what is inside the heads. Thank you very much.